more about the future and focus on the future resistance against Russia, because we understand the existential nature of the challenges and the fact that the future generations of Ukrainians will have to live with such a neighbor, with a threat, and we need to understand what is happening inside. The matter of teaching history is also important, because the Putin regime has always considered it as a foundation to cultivate the political loyalty in the Russian public. So the key questions we will have: school history is a rule for cultivating political loyalty among the Russian population, the specifics of Russian pseudo-historical propaganda in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and history is a battlefield, how Russia plans to intervene in the history textbooks of neighboring countries. The speakers of our event will be Serhii, Terepyshchyi, the professor of the Department of Social Philosophy, Philosophy of Education and Educational Policy of the Ukrainian State University, named after Mykhailo Drahomanov. Also, Alina Ponepolyak, the candidate of Historical Sciences, Maxim Vikhrov, the chief analyst of the Center of Strategic Communications and Information Safety, Yegor Brailan, the candidate of Historical Sciences, also Anna Murlaykivna, the journalist, the chief editor of the website Mariupol 0629, Mykhailo Sinayuk, expert of the program of Russian and Belarusian studies of the Analytical Center, Ukrainska Prisma. I would like to give the floor to Serhii as a researcher. And could you please outline your point of view from the viewpoint of philosophy? You know, I was making to your studio, and I thought that this day is an anti-day. It's the last... Maybe Russian planners, when they were planning an invasion, they were using this date for a reason. In fact, we are fighting against a dangerous enemy, and our fight should be not only on the battlefield but also inside our mindset. A few days ago, I visited the Castle of Modern Culture, McDonald's. You know, there was Yaroslav, McDonald's employee. He was waiting for people to come and place an order, but no one was coming because we had those screens when you can order it on your own. And you know, I thought that we are not feeling comfortable with people, unlike the screens. The population of Russia lives in the conditions of social ascetics. So, you know, I wouldn't overestimate the importance of textbooks, because this is just a small foundation. We have to work more with social media, with the youth that communicate in TikTok. But today I saw Yaroslav in McDonald's again. You know, he had a solid tool, and he was trying to clear the road of ice. And you know, I would like to mention another historian, Mark Ferro, who has a brilliant piece of work about how children across the world are told and taught about the history. He analyzes the history of the US, Africa, Europe, other parts of the world, and shows how manipulative the approach towards history textbooks is across the world, and he shows the way out. The way out should start off with the history of your family, from albums, from photos. When you ask about the history of your family, your village, town, and only after the history regarding rulers. Here, I would like to proceed with my key concept that emerged 4 years ago. I call it a concept of the Pope Francis generation. Currently, we are living in the world where things matter only here and now. When we do not have the future, the category of the future, and we can plan only for the next 5 minutes, next week. So currently we are living through the age of dark water of our reality. We do not have any guarantees that someone will lend you a hand. You know, the generation of pontiffs is just a small group of people who understands that the times of architects is in the past, like it is in Russia. In Russia, they are architects. They are publishing million copies of textbooks and all that. But just believe me, they will lose because the world has changed. So speaking of our today's event, I would like to mention that a textbook is a weapon that could be used both for the good and to destroy people's mindset. I understand that we have to work with people's media literacy. So today we are talking about temporarily occupied territories. And I would add that we also need to deoccupy our mindset, because textbooks, they can be published again and again, but the mindset of the generation of the people who grew up in the period of time from 2014 till our times, they have a different mindset. And here we could apply Mark Ferro's approach that we should start from our family, from our village history, which is clear of others' narratives when it comes to existential matters. So we have to work with the mindset of the next generation. Thank you so much for such an insightful introductory speech. And now I would like to give the floor to Alina, a historian. My question is, do you think that the war against Russia will be over and Ukraine will emerge victorious? We often say that Ukraine does not have resources to win the war. with military means. But what about the historical prospects? We can see that many people are asking themselves in Russian, what's next? Yeah, we will seize some other parts of Ukrainian territories, but what goes after that? So the Kremlin tries to choose they choose to correct all of this using their propaganda. So in your view, can we talk about the imperial Russia, history speaking, until there is an objective and impartial approach to writing history textbooks in Russia? So, I mean, whether it is possible to help the Russian society recover. You know, we have to take off our red-colored glasses, and we should understand that in Russia, history is only a means for propaganda that is interpreted by the society. They are building narratives around the big domestic war, and they are comparing it with the current Russian aggression on the territory of Ukraine. As my colleague has already mentioned, we are here today, the day which marks the fourth anniversary of full-scale Russian invasion, which has become a matter of European security and safety as well. What Russians have done, what their dictator has done, shows that they interpret history differently. So today we see that they are using their textbooks, history textbooks, to cultivate and promote propaganda, analyzing the history textbooks that they were disseminating in the temporarily occupied territories. I have paper books. I reached the conclusion that for them it is very important to build a narrative of the common past of Ukraine and Russia, and that all the territories that were part of the Soviet Union are genuinely Russian. And the problem is that Russians, they will always want to conquer our territories, our Ukraine, and our war is against this. We need to acknowledge, understand the danger that is posed by Russians. You know, the new generation of Russians that are intoxicated with this propaganda. And, you know, Russia is a part of Eurasia, but we should understand that what is happening today is a war for the language, history, identity, and this hybrid character nature of the war poses big risks for our state, for our country. So I'm sure that when we are talking about the victory in our modern understanding, let us admit that the existence of Ukraine as a state is already a big victory for us, because in 2022 we were given 3 days, but today it has been already 4 years into the full-scale invasion, and we can extend our gratitude to the armed forces of Ukraine for having this opportunity to have this discussion today about the challenges, consequences for Ukraine, and about what to do, how to handle Russian occupiers that will be trying to come and establish their order here by returning our cities to their empire that they consider Russian. Stalin managed to do that in 1945. Putin believed that they would do that in 3 days. But today, the armed forces of Ukraine, they are guiding Russian army that came to conquer not only our territory, but our identity, our language and history. Having analyzed their textbooks, I achieved a conclusion that for them it is important to blur identity, that Russia is a multinational country, and the territories that it holds power on, they are genuinely Russian territories, and in their history they state that the big Russian people brought together other nations. I do not believe the fact that Russia will crumble into other states, but of course the power, the strength of Russia will be lower and lower every year. I take it that they have 100 million people left there, and I think that we will face another huge problem also concerning Europe. I think that, maybe I have a kind of archaic thinking, but Nuremberg is not impossible for Russia. They will have to face it, of course, definitely. Thank you so much for such words that help us understand the role of Russian propaganda. And now I would like to proceed with another topic, the usage of Russian pseudo-historical science and the interpretations that existed in the school curriculum. We know that the Russians had been working for many years to unify all the curriculum syllabus, and they made amendments to the law on education, and many researchers mentioned that 2019-2020 were important years because the Kremlin switched to a even more totalitarian regime. But there happened other humanitarian changes regarding history, education, propaganda that we are observing today. And we see how well thought they were. And back then they planned aggression against Ukraine because, all of this started in 2019, 2020, and the unification of school curriculum became one of the tools. Now I would like to give the floor to Maxim Vikhrov and ask your question about the effectiveness of this approach, because we have an example of the Soviet Union when the history textbooks were full of ideology, but it did not prevent the USSR from the fall down. So what is your take on this, whether Russian policy will benefit the Russian Federation? Thank you so much for your question. On the one hand, we should not, of course, ignore the curriculum they introduce, but on the other side, we should not simplify this problem, because considering the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, we observe textbooks saturated with ideology, promoting specific narratives, and this is one of the parts of the occupying forces policy. This policy has intensified a lot in recent years. So it means that occupying administrations, they are militarizing younger generations. They do not care about seniors. These are the people that they do not care about at all. They just need them, to take some pictures when they go to a village where 3 senior ladies live. They give them buckwheat and they say that Putin is really good. So they do not really need them. But the young people are considered as a manpower. So looking at propaganda means in the temporarily occupied territories, I conducted a monitoring and looking at everything that is happening there, different exhibitions, concerts, and all that. Approximately 40% are about the big domestic war. Also 20% about culture, religion, of course, 40% about their special military operation. So the narratives about the special military operation and the Great Patriotic War are combined. They are saying that our granddads were fighting against Hitler. Here we have our heroes engaged in the special military operation. It might sound hilarious, but this is the danger. They are imposing this narrative by means of school education. Also, they are engaging children into different paramilitary organizations. There are many organizations like this that they have, and so on and so forth. Also, they have different basic trainings organized for our children, different excursions, militarized camps, and what we can see is the whole cycle of ideological processing of our children. So in the temporarily occupied territories, these people are isolated from information, from the society, and if a child does not take asking the information during the history class, they will consume it at different events, because Russia is militarizing the Ukrainian people under their authority. And why are they doing that? Because they want our people to become cannon fodder for their future wars. Maybe, it may happen that our war has been going on, and our scholars will grow up and will have to fight their fellow citizens. For example, in Donbass, no one is talking about miners and all that. This narrative is still existing, but it is, being forgotten. But the Kremlin considers Donbass as the center of the Russian propaganda. It is really sad, because people are living under their occupation in the so-called Russian peace, but there is no Russian peace. It's just the propaganda. People are to fulfill just one mission: die for Putin. I would like to remind how Russia occupied the southern part of Ukraine. They were bringing in tons of Russian textbooks, of Russian books, and Ukrainian libraries were just burnt down. We had those photos when Ukrainian books were thrown away. They were lying on the streets, and it was really hard to believe, especially for someone who was not exploring Russian narratives. And the extent of their degradation is really significant. We do remember that the war has been grinding since 2014, and we have to analyze in detail the processes in Russian society, in the curricula that they create, because they embody the future plans of Ukraine regarding their aggressive policy. As we have already mentioned the temporarily occupied territories, I would like to give the floor to Anna, journalist from Mariupol. I would like to ask you, as an explorer of what Russians are doing to impose the Russian propaganda information onto Ukrainians. So, is there a difference between the temporarily occupied territories situation and the situation in the territory of the Russian Federation? So, is there any difference in the ideological upbringing of Ukrainian school children? Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much for giving me the floor to talk about education, about our children, because it is about the future of our country, whether we will be able to save our kids' minds from Russian propaganda. Answering your questions, I would say yes, there are some differences. I will add a few words to my colleague who was exploring Russian textbooks. In the temporarily occupied territories, I also explored their textbooks. I had a chance to compare the textbooks, one of which was written by Medinsky and the other one was written without him. So I can state that even if the facts they remain the same, interpretation of these facts is not academic anymore. If in the textbooks of 8th graders, 9th graders, where they describe the Russian Empire, Russian Federation of the Kyiv Rus, they are using neutral language, but in the latest textbooks editions, this is what Solovyov, Kiselyov are saying. Their narratives about the borders of the Russian Federation, which are not even existing. So they are just citing those figures using obscene language. Compared to history classes in the temporarily occupied territories and the territory of the Russian Federation, there is one very important difference, but a fundamental one. In the Russian Federation area, they are unifying the curricula and they are trying to explain to the nations that are part of the Russian Federation that they have been genuinely Russian and that the Russian nation is bringing everyone together. For Ukrainians, they have a different version. The main narrative that is aired at every class our children have does not matter whether it's physics, art, or history. Their main narrative is that Ukraine does not exist. If you open the textbook for 8th graders, you will find multiple synonyms of the word Ukraine. Small Russia and all that, but no words about Ukraine as a state. And this is what teachers are teaching our children during their classes when they are talking about important things. And they have a class which is saturated with propaganda, which is called talks about important things. So the Kremlin doesn't have a lot of faith in our educators that remained in temporarily occupied territories. That is why they had to be retrained, and the teacher, for example, of biology could not start teaching. I talked to a teacher who now works in the temporarily occupied Mariupol. They were sent to a very expensive hotel. They were given luxurious food in restaurants, like all the tickets expenses were covered. So they are using money to get the people side with them and serve the Russian Empire. Of course, this affects both children and teachers. How do teachers and children mask their beliefs? Because not everyone has them changed. Especially this is related to the adolescents, teenagers, and they are not afraid of asking their teachers questions. For example, 4 years ago, you were telling us about Ukraine, you were singing Ukrainian national anthem, but today you are telling us about a big, great Russian Federation. And some teachers respond that they have to do it for safety and security reasons, and teachers recommend saying this. And when the situation changes, our rhetoric will be changed as well. Of course, for a teacher, it is not safe to say such things because after Russians occupied the Ukrainian territories, reading got back, and children are afraid of talking to their school children. And some teachers are conducting information operations among children to find out whether they are also attending Ukrainian schools. And if this is found out, such families are exposed to repressions. They are receiving threats, for example, that their child will be sent to institutional facility and removed from their parental care if their children attend Ukrainian schools. So for Ukraine, it is a big task to, make this safe for our children, and I believe that experts in this direction have to search for the right solution, how to get through to each child who wants to remain in the Ukrainian information space. Of course, every year, the number of such children is going down because the children from primary school, they are not protected from Russian comprehensive influence which comes from the preschool. Thank you so much, Anna. You outlined such topics that do hurt because we already observed the occupation of the Donetsk and Luhansk territories in 2014 when we thought that it was temporary, but now we do understand that the generations there, they are full of Russian propaganda. They can see themselves in Russia in the future, and what Russians are trying to promote after the full-scale invasion. We can see it from social media, like Kyiv, Telegram, Instagram, so they are actively advocating for enrollment at Russian universities. They are filming videos with the graduates of different schools at the temporarily occupied territories where children are talking with joy about the universities that they would like to enroll at, and it shows the long term of the Russian Federation. And here we cannot even say that Russia singles out the Ukrainian nation into a separate subgroup, but currently the Kremlin started to fully integrate the Ukrainian people into the Russian piece. Of course, there is nothing Ukrainian from them in the occupied territories. So I guess that history is the last thing that we should be, is our last resort, So we should use all the means we can to get through to our children in the temporarily occupied territories. And here another important thing is digital battle. In 2026, I guess we will see an inflection point when Russia will attempt to set up an information block and use those messengers and social media that under full control of the Russian special forces, which restricts access to those social media. So, of course, this makes communication harder, and this is the challenge that we will face in the near future. So we would like to understand that the state of Ukraine does not abandon its children and has some measures to counter Russian propaganda in the field of education. Now I would like to give the floor to Yehor, if you can hear us. Yehor, are you with us? Hello? Yehor? We will not be able to hear, sorry, Yehor, because of some technical issues. All right, then we will be giving the floor to our next speaker, Mykhailo from the Prisma Center. I would like to ask you about your vision. To what extent Russian propaganda in education in schools is effective, and taken into consideration the decline in the Russian economy, and whether Russians will the competition. And today the main tunnel for the Russian science remains China, but here their languages are very much different, and of course this will be somehow slowing down the development of Russian science. So do you have any reflections about whether they can develop their science? Hello, dear colleagues. I am very sorry in advance if you hear me losing my voice. I'm a bit sick. So I would like to mention right away that history taught at schools is not only in Russia or Belarus, in the majority of the countries, is not an academic science in its pure understanding. This is a tool of civic upbringing. For example, if in our universities we can have discussions, revisions, different methodologies, in schools we have the different situation. Schools just have a unified approach. This is the place where we can receive the answers to the questions: who we are, what a political norm is, heroism is, and so on and so forth. So the question is not whether history is a tool of the state policy. As I have already mentioned, it is a tool of the state policy in every country, but what matters is the values that it promotes, whether it's about empire or democracy. So, getting back to Russia, in recent years we can see that they are using history in their authoritarian regime. In 2022, they introduced the unified textbook that was written by Medinsky, and we know his approach that history has to be state-oriented, positive. It should not ask any questions or form critical thinking, but it has to cement loyalty. Speaking of Alexander Dughin's ideas, the chief ideologist in Russia currently, his concept of Eurasian civilization, we will have a comprehensive ideological matrix in which Ukraine is not a separate historical entity, and not only Ukraine but also the Baltic countries, Belarus, and other countries. So these countries are depicted as the ones that are subject to external influence. At the school level, this scheme forms the mindset of school children, and then they implement it in their life. So they select some facts, and school children do not see all the facts, but only the facts that reinforce the state narrative. Also some language terms, some reunification, historical soil, common fate. Those are not some neutral terms. These are the markers of the political stance. The next stage of forming their ideology is an emotional code, the concept of the fortress, where everyone around is an enemy, creates a permanent feeling of an external danger, which simplifies the draft of the civilians for the sake of the Kremlin regime. And I do not really like this term, but I hardly ever use it, but the normalization of the empire mindset. If a child is used to hearing something about a big mission, some interest of a big country, a big state. When this child is grown up, they will consider expansion, the war efforts as historically conditioned and justified. In the temporarily occupied territories, they are using education to destroy people's identity that had been formed during the 30 years of of Ukrainian independence. And history there becomes a tool of cultural integration through negating the alternative Ukrainian vision. And here I would like to proceed with the strategic dimension. We often respond in a very reactive way to these processes. Whenever a new textbook emerges, we start analyzing it. Whenever there is a new statement, we are trying to negate it. And this strategy is not effective. It means that we are constantly in the context created by the Kremlin regime, which is the defense position. But talking about strategic communications, we have to switch from the defensive framing to agenda setting. I mean, to set up our agenda on our own, to adjust it to our vision. We do not have to prove that we are different from what they are depicting us, but, just shape our vision. Ukraine has all the preconditions to form an alternative post-Soviet discourse, not as a victim of aggression, no. And, historical policy plays an important role because we can offer an alternative memory model, which is not about the Russian Empire, but about partnership. Instead of the concept of historical influence areas, we can, for example, introduce the concept of regional solidarity or the coexistence at the same conditions. And it is not the matter of it is the matter of heavy investment into our own memory policy, to have our narratives, our interpretation frames, so that these narratives are quite powerful, especially at the international arena. At the very end of my speech, I would like to mention that school history is not about the past, it's about forming the future, about the architecture of the future. If we do not want to be an object of Russian interpretation, we have to be active in historical discourse, whether we want it or not. Because if we do not do that, we will have to fight all the time and remain in the position of a victim. Thank you, Mykhailo. Your remarks have been very sound, especially about the fact that we have to form our own discourse and, Russian actions, they negatively impress experts from different parts of the world, and this is our chance to prove the Ukraine as the state. And I think that many specialists that were exploring Russia previously are now more focused on exploring the history of Ukraine. The Russia is getting isolated. It is harder to explore their trends, so Ukraine will be in the focus of their attention. Probably we will have more Ukrainian studios, and I think that this is what our authorities should keep in mind, especially when we are working with international audience. And we have another speaker, Yehor Brailan. Yehor, I have a question to you. In your opinion, can we build an ideology around history in our modern world? Whether history can become a platform for ideology. I mean, what Russia is doing now, they dismantled the communist path and based on the myth about the great patriotic war, they are trying to promote it. So, is it viable or not? Yehor, we cannot hear you. Yes, hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It is a very important topic, and responding to your question, I would like to say that we have seen how history can be used to form an imperial ideology, but looking at history classes at school, it has always been a tool of civic upbringing. For example, like in French, that they have different nations. I would like to remind about how modern imperial ideology emerged in Russia. They emerged during the Russian Soviet Union times, when different historians, philosophers, they established an association headed by Khreshchatyk, and they formed the main ideas of the modern Putin regime, because in the Soviet Union, yes, there was a kind of ideology. It was evolving because there was the Soviet Union under Lenin and after, but what Putin did was that he turned it into an eclectic one. He just mixed three parts. One, communist ideology, post-Soviet nostalgia, and here we have Hirkin, Srilkov, and love for the white movement, and Orthodox Christianity of the Russian nature, like FSB. And this mixture has formed the ideology that we have today. my sense is that, in fact, in Russia, they do not really believe what they are told at history classes. Once I saw a video when the school children were not really interested to hear about different battles of Russia. They are more interested in social media usage. Russia has a system of patriotic upbringing, militarization of children, and this indoctrination that existed in the Soviet times has been preserved, but in modern Russia they pay a lot of attention to influencers like Dudь, who plays a much bigger role than all those collaborators and the rest. So the main task for us all should be to form our own vision of Russian history, and currently very little attention is paid to that. I think that we have to work on the methodological level to provide all the information to the world and justify why Russian science is propaganda. And I also wanted to mention another important statement, that the developments in 2014, 2022, it might sound like a paradox, but in Ukraine we knew very little about Russia, and in Russia they knew very little about Ukraine. So Russia didn't have any centers of Ukrainian studios. Tatiana Taira was exploring the Kazakhs, but she left abroad. So there were no people who were studying Ukraine. Same goes for Ukraine. There were not many people studying Russia. And of course there were some researchers, analysts who were working on the analysis of the Soviet times, but I think that if we explore Russia, their history, will allow us to take over and will give us a chance to fight at the information battlefield. We have to take into consideration everything. We cannot underestimate our adversary, because Russians, they have infiltrated into Western universities, institutes, and they were imposing their vision of history. We cannot win them quantitatively, but we can do it qualitatively. And for this, we need our historians, our experts, who will contribute to these efforts, which of course affect the school education in Ukraine. And I would like to really see it. We have to better learn the history of Russia. And there was such an attitude that we were saying, like, why do we need their history? I remember that in the Shevchenko University, two departments were combined, and now we are, reaping the fruits of little attention towards Russian history. But I do hope that we will win this war, which is not that much about territory, but about the mindset. So Russians, they are more focused on the past, we are focused on the future. Thank you. Thank you so much, Yehor. I do relate to your statement that we also need our experts who will be able to conceptualize the vision of the Ukrainian future. But yes, indeed, we want it not within some information bubbles, but we should have some communication channels with the wider public. We should engage the young people who are very tech savvy, and of course we should keep in mind the integration into the European, Western tendencies, platforms, that we should strengthen Ukrainian influence, because we have to destroy Russians who have been benefiting to those platforms for all these years. Currently, there is a movement which is for removing the word Russia from the Eurasia statement. One lady works in Oxford, and she mentioned this on her Facebook page. But we have to explain that we do not just want to cancel Russians, but we want to explain why these modern Russian studies, they are not correct, academically speaking, why they are distorting the reality. We will see the result, but the process has already started. We will see the development of the research studies. Of course, in Russia, they are not really quick, but I guess that we can change the whole thing and learn about Ukraine in the European context. And at the very end, we are very close to the end of our discussion. I would like to give the floor to Serhii for his final remark, maybe feedback regarding our discussion. Thank you so much, Volodymyr. Thank you so much for our multifaceted discussion. I have many notes, but I would like to say that Russians, they are even afraid of the word Ukraine. They are using other words, neologisms, just avoid the word Ukraine. I recently saw a video from a Russian channel which said that Ukrainian national symbol, a trident, is not a Ukrainian one but a Russian one, and they are trying to make our trident theirs. Also, this is what Ivan Ohienko mentioned when he said that only at the time when Ukrainians use a translator talking to Russians, we will see And we see that the issue of the language and the history is closely intertwined. And Russians are not really interested in territories as much, but in symbols and ideas. They are trying to appropriate Taras Shevchenko, Lesa Ukrainka, Ivan Franko. We will not win the war. We will win the war when the Kyiv Bridge in Russia will be renamed. So they are trying to appropriate our symbols, our heroes, and the only exception could be Stepan Bandera, Petlura. They do not consider them Russian public figures, and we are really grateful. And I would like to finish with a story about Eurasia and the fact that Russia considers itself a Eurasia, not a Europe, but a separate civilization with their journey, but in fact they are not even a Eurasia. They are somewhere in Asia of medieval form. We should not keep silent about this, and the new generation of the people who are building bridges and instead of walls, I guess this is our solution. And the person who is building a bridge will always win instead of the one who is building walls. So it is important to build horizontal connections, these bridges, and what Yehor has mentioned, for example, our speaker, that we do not have to close down the departments of Russian studies, that we have to really study them deeply. We should not cancel their existence like in memes. It's a great meme when we have an ocean instead of Russia, but that's not a great strategy. We will have to live next to them. We need to learn to live next to them if we are not planning to occupy them, and learn to live with this neighbor when they are not recognizing our state. So we have to rely on our own power and strengths, and we have to build the bridges with the civilized world. Thank you so much for this discussion. Serhii, I would like to add from my side that Ukraine has to develop Russian studies at the level of universities, analytical centers, but another important thing is to avoid the ideologization of this direction in order to avoid their aggressive policy against Ukraine. So yes, in fact, we should take into consideration the necessity of such studios, and I guess that this will be one of the promising streams of arts in Ukraine and other institutions regarding safety and security of Ukraine. So there must be a synergy between different branches of the Ukrainian state so that we are prepared for the future, so that we do not have to prepare for 2030 or something. We have to be constantly prepared, and we have to follow the trends that are happening in Russia, because there might be a stagnation, but then the opposite situation in a few weeks, and then the world is not ready for such developments. And this lack of readiness caused the strategic mistakes that enabled the Kremlin to form their fascist regime. Our time is up. This topic is very deep, requires more detailed analysis. I think that we will keep a close eye on the development of historical science in Russia, which is a pseudoscience, because the main narrative revolves around their propaganda and narrative, which serves the Russian military machine, which raises the so-called patriots. So we do not deal with the history as an educational process, but we should handle it like as a preparation of the future occupying forces. So thank you so much for being with us, all the speakers, participants of the discussion, and see you